What's up, everybody? My name is Malia, and this is The Reclamation. Today, my guest, Joy Curtis, brings to the conversation an insightful perspective on culture, what it means to be human, and how we are all alike, yet at the same time, we are different and shouldn't seek to change those differences. Or, and this is really interesting, even have a need to be where we don't need to be. So it's a really interesting statement and it'll make more sense throughout the episode. It's an alternative view on what unity is, where there exists within unity the allowance of being different, the allowance of letting the other remain other. The conversation's jumping off point stems from Joy's art, which I happened across online, and it really inspired me. And I needed to bring Joy on and have her speak about her series, specifically her series of Native American sketches that she did for Native American Heritage Month back in November. You can find those pieces linked in the show notes. Please check them out. They're really, really beautiful. Joy sought to capture in this series how we are all human in the same ways. She shares the wisdom she's gleaned from her experience with this series and through her lived life with the Dine, also more commonly known as the Navajo Nation. I really love how Joyce experiences the lessons she has learned and the ways that she moved through creating this series of sketches can lead us to a reclamation in the depth that exists in the pause, in the stillness of life, and in how we perceive ourselves and others. I learned a lot in this conversation. I did a lot of self-reflection post-recording as well in the ways that I'm showing up, possibly authentically in my need to be seen as a good person, as accepting, as culturally correct. And it's unauthentic because I have this agenda behind the way I'm approaching conversation, the way I'm approaching relationship, because I have a need to be seen in a certain light versus the genuine interest. And the genuine interest, it does exist. And I perceive myself to be leading from the genuine interest, which is true. But also the self-reflection in what also exists here is the need to be seen in a certain light. So that's definitely something that was brought to my attention. I thought was very interesting and will be something that I will be working towards just adjusting, because none of it is really done in intention to harm anybody else. But for sure, if I can come from a more aligned place, and what I mean by aligned for myself, it's just in without the underlying agenda of how am I being perceived in this, which honestly, is this not a lifelong pursuit for sure. Okay, as you know, I have a series coming up that reflects on the reclamation of sex and sexuality, embodiment, being in our bodies, with our bodies, and all the layers and layers of shame that come from a lot of cultural conditioning. That series is coming up. I'm so excited for it. If you have thoughts or questions in regard to your own experiences, or even how you might teach children certain concepts of their sexuality, of loving their bodies and accepting their bodies, and please DM me on Instagram. You can post questions to my show notes in Spotify if you're listening from there, and also YouTube if you're listening from there. All the links are in the show notes, no matter what platform you are listening from. I also wanted to let you know, if you did not know, I am a trauma-informed somatic coach and mentor. I love to help people find safety within their bodies and to experience life in a more aligned and alive ways. One of the ways I help my clients to reclaim themselves is learning to hear the messages that their body is sending. And I use techniques like EFT and regression and somatic techniques to help to achieve that. And the people I serve are those who are interested in living in alignment to their soul's desires and leading a life that is alive. So if you're interested in that, you can reach out to me via email, which is also, of course, linked in the show notes. Okay, I hope you really enjoyed this episode. Would love to hear the insights that you glean from this, and maybe even possibly some of the ways that you recognize you're showing up that desire some modification. Okay, enjoy the episode, and I'll see you all next week. Welcome, Joy. Thank you so much for setting aside time to come and chat with me.
Thanks. I'm excited.
Yes, me too. So, just as a short little intro, because I want to have a background for my listeners, I think that your situation is more unique still in a cross culture relationship in marriage. So, go ahead and give me your background.
Love my falling in love story.
Oh, good. Yeah.
I feel like everyone should love their own falling in love story.
Yeah.
So my husband and we met through like a couple of mutual friends, a series of events. But in short, I was just about to graduate from Brigham Young University, and I was studying early childhood education, international relations, which is essentially education abroad.
Yeah.
And I was looking for a job, and I was looking for a job, and I had a friend recommend that I apply to teach on the reservation. And so I sent out my application, and I remember thinking to myself, I'm going to get 5 job offers, and then I'm going to choose whichever job offer fits what I want the most. And my older self, because it's been about 10 years, my older self is like 5 job offers is it's like a lot of job offers,
It's like
honestly.
you're in an ideal situation there.
Right. I do not think my older self would have had that like 5. That's what I need, right?
Yeah.
So I did exactly that. I sent out my resume to different areas. And within 2 weeks, I had 5 job offers.
Amazing.
And I evaluated them, and I was trying to be so strategic, right? But I had made like my little list of all the things that they needed to have. And the one that fit all of those things was in Ojo, New Mexico. And it just happened to be where my now husband lives. And his family lived across the street from the school where I worked at. And upon meeting my husband, he was so handsome. I was completely Twitter pated. And he was like, this is a very chatty girl. He was not quite as immediately Twitter pated. He likes to remind people at the time he was dating someone else, so he wasn't like looking or anything like that.
Yes.
But I was completely swooned. So then
Mm.
I moved to the reservation, and I lived on what's referred to as a border town. So I actually did not live on the reservation. I lived on a border town. And then I would drive in and I taught on there. And at that same time, my husband was enrolled at UVU, and I'm from Utah Valley. So anytime that I'd come up to Utah, I'd intentionally reconnect with him. And then
Oh.
anytime that he went down to New Mexico, because I was teaching across this from the school where he was at, he would connect with me. And
Mm.
then we were texting all the time, and we were calling, and we were FaceTiming. And then we were engaged, and now we're married.
Oh, amazing.
But
So
I will,
cool.
yeah, so,
I hear in your story 100% that you manifested this. Making
oh,
that list, stating 5 job offers, the one that fit everything was the one you were going to say yes to, and I love that it was also so kismet, lined up so serendipitously to match you also with your husband. It's such a cool story in just manifesting what we're like really desiring here, not realizing like this is going to line me up for so many other things in life.
Oh,
And it's lined you up for where you are now and the things you're expressing through art too. It's really cool.
it was life changing. I mean, obviously, marriage typically is life changing, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, so that's where I start. I kind of started from there, and now, like I said, it's been about 10 years, so that's where we're at now.
Okay, so for Native American Heritage Month back in November, you decided that you were going to do these series of sketches to kind of celebrate the month. And you wanted them to be real like life situations that were just everyday situations. Tell me what inspired you to want to start that series.
One of it is that my husband loves football,
Oh,
like a lot. He loves following, he loves athletics, he can follow it really well. And why that relates to this conversation is that I feel like when I'm talking to people or introduce them to my husband or they get introduced to him, they are asking him all of these very kind of intrusive personal questions about his race and culture. And very rarely when people get like introduced to him, do they ask him questions about something common like football.
hmm.
And that's personal to me because, of course, like I love my husband's culture. I love how it fills my home and my family. But part of that culture is commonness, the normality, the day-to-dayness. And I feel like when we try and make other cultures too exotic, we miss the humanity.
Mm.
And when we start to perceive and observe and interact with other cultures, we get to see the normality. And I mean the normality in the most beautiful, inclusive, sacred space possible, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And so that was kind of one of my things is when I was reflecting on this series, I was really trying to think of how do I take another culture that's not my own culture, and how do I highlight and feature the normality in a beautiful and inclusive way.
You just wanted people to enter into your lives, into your home, into meeting your husband and seeing him as just another, like a dude, a guy that you can relate to at very foundational levels. I'm really curious at some of the questions that would bother you that he would get asked, because I think it's good to bring those things to light. Some of the things you're saying about um, making cultures exotic and how it disconnects us from each other when we do that. Perhaps in our minds when we're like, oh, you're someone different than me. And I want to know all about these really interesting things that I just see equals who you are. What are some of the questions that people would ask that you were like, eh?
Uh, so I have two kind of group of questions. So the first group of questions I feel like is any time someone asks a question where where they're expecting the responder to represent a whole group of people. So that's any kind of question where it's like, well, in this scenario, like, how do natives feel about this? Right?
Mm, mm,
And so any kind of question that takes one individual and puts them up in the front as if they could represent that entire group, right? And on top of that, if we break it down, Native American cultures are that's a lot of cultures,
yeah,
right? That's a ton of, I think like it's over 400 recognized tribes right now. I
yeah.
can't remember. Somebody in the comments will probably correct us. But there's hundreds of different Native American tribes. And that's just North America. That's not counting First Nations from Canada. That's not counting in other indigenous groups in Central and South America. And so when somebody says, all right, well, tell me, how do natives feel about X? That question lacks the knowledge of really what a diversity or what an experience is. And
Mm,
then the other group that I think is sometimes I'm going to try and explain this. When I interact with people, there's there's questions that they ask where they're so afraid that they are going to be offensive that
Yeah.
they just ask like so many questions, so many questions where they're like, I don't want to be offensive, so I'm going to ask you like 20 questions to avoid offending you, right?
Interesting.
And what I find a little interesting about the, I do understand the desire to not offend people, but there's kind of a selfish way to approach that in my mind, and then there's a selfless way to approach that. So if the only reason that you don't want to offend other people is so that they like you, so that they're impressed by you, so that they think that you're wonderful, so that they think you're highly educated, you your intent is actually very selfish. You just want to be liked. You
Mm-hmm.
don't want to offend other people and other cultures because really your intent is you just want them to like you,
Mm. And you
right?
want to show that I'm interested in you. I'm a good human being. It's like stroking our own sense of ego of like I am a good human being.
Yes, very much like I am a good person.
uh,
And then there's a selfless way where you're really watching the other person. You're watching their facial features and their really subtle language. And you're really trying to see it. And then you say something and you're like, ooh, ooh, I saw in their face. I saw in how they responded that what I said, like you're holding yourself accountable, right? You're like, oh, what I said was probably not there. I can tell in how they responded to me. So now I'm going to ask them. I'm going to ask them a clarification. I'm going to ask them and be like, hey, I noticed when I said X, you responded with Y.
yeah.
Could you help me understand that? And you can see the difference in the intent with that kind of questioning, right?
Yes, it's so beautiful. And I think a lot of our conversation is going to really center around this idea of listening, listening with our eyes and listening with our hearts. And how, when we're in connection, in conversation with another, and when we're doing that, how that creates the connection that you are seeking to promote through this series of art and then the ongoing things that you have planned that you'll talk about later. And so I love that advice and that wisdom. It was such wisdom in the way that we can approach anybody, and especially somebody that is on the outset different than who we are. It's funny because when you're talking about the person who shows up, wants to ask a bunch of questions, and maybe it's out of curiosity genuinely, and then also there's this thing happening possibly inside that's like, again, it's like I want to be a good person and I want to show up in this world to where I'm inclusive and I'm welcoming, but I don't really know how to do that, and so I'm just going to kind of blah 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 out of myself. And it's a reflection, I think, on our own ability to view ourselves in discomfort when we can slow down and listen, which was your second example, versus when we're like, I need to show up this way. I need to be seen this way. And so I'm just going to like run that engine so that I can have this outcome of being perceived as good, right?
Yes.
And it's interesting because I was like, oh, I have been in those situations and I can tell when I'm in it because I'm just like, it's just spilling out of me. And I'm like, I can't reel this back in. It's too late. Right. And so, really, my last two previous episodes, we really focused on being present and being in that moment, even in the discomfort we might feel of like, oh, I don't know how to ask questions to you. Maybe it's my first time meeting somebody of your race that has a culture that you have. And anyway, so I really appreciate that wisdom that you brought too. help us just pay attention how we're showing up in that conversation. I think that this will segue real nicely into some of these questions that I had for you in your experience with um, the Navajo. And I forgot already how to say it because I think I want to say it Dene, but it's
Didn't
Dine.
Yeah.
They refer to themselves as Dine. Is there a difference between Navajo and Dine?
Yes. And it
Okay.
does relate to our conversation at large. So, most indigenous cultures will typically have their like recognized, federal recognized name. In this case, it's Navajo.
Okay.
And then they have their language name. In this case, it's Dene. And Dene just means the people. And in most of my research, most cultures call themselves the people,
Mm-hmm.
right? Which does kind of make sense because if someone's like, who are these? And you're like, oh, that's my family. That's my people,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so that's really natural, I feel like, in a language to be like, yeah, like this is, the people, right? Um, a word like Navajo typically arises when when the US government was coming into North America, they would work with some tribes, pin up other tribes against another, and it would be another tribe's name for that group of people, right? And so um, Navajo, I can't remember even which tribe, so now this history lesson is kiboshed. But but Navajo was what another tribe called the people, if that
This
makes any
is
sense.
this is fascinating.
Right. And so typically those names were a little insulting if we directly
Okay.
translate them. If that makes any sense, just because of the nature of it, is that so I want to say it was the Ute, and someone can correct me. I'm all up for learning. But in this case, if Navajo is a Ute word, the Navajo and the Ute people historically did not get along. And
Mhm.
so if I was talking about a group of people I didn't get along with, I'd be like, those nasty people. And that would be like now the word that we're using historically to call them. Does that make any sense?
Because we can see so clearly all over the place how we have done that. And the one that came to my mind was the Yanks and the Redcoats, right? And so the Yanks was a very derogatory term, and so was Redcoats, and then that's how they referred to each other. And so this is really great history lesson. And so they do not refer to themselves as Navajo.
I mean, it's the easiest name because now it's recognized. Right.
Okay,
So if
and
my
so then
husband
then
introduced,
yeah.
yeah, if my husband introduced himself, I feel like he would most likely be like, oh, like I'm from the Navajo Nation and things like that. Right. But if
Okay.
you are talking in like the inner circle, the preference is Dene.
Dinner. Okay. That's so good and so fascinating to me. And hopefully it doesn't put people into this position of like, oh no, now I'm even more incorrect all of the time. But it is interesting how like those nicknames that can begin as derogatory, even in our own lives, like maybe we got a nickname when we were in elementary school and it ended up sticking with us. And then we're like, yeah, you can call me that, or that's what people know me as. Here's my real name or what I prefer. But yes, people know me as this. Um, it is interesting how sometimes we can turn that derogatory term into just like, this is how people know me. Your husband is like, I am from the Navajo Nation because that's how you're going to know. You're not going to know Dinah. You're going to know
And then
Navajo.
I think making the historical connection, because like now at this point, like now you know, like if you heard the word Dene, you would be like, oh,
Yes.
like the Southern indigenous tribes in the Four Corners area, right? Like
Yeah.
that kind of, so sometimes I think that it's really helpful if you take, in this case, an example, a word like Navajo, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you give it the historical understanding, a little more context, instead of having that like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I like offended people and I've been saying this my whole life, is really embracing that. Now I know. right? And now
Yes.
I can take this knowledge and share it with other people. I mean, you've
Yes.
given a whole platform and this is what we're talking about, so that's great, you know? So
Yeah.
now we know, right?
Now we know. And that's a different approach too, to not getting stressed out about, do I offend people when I say this or that, but understanding, like you do, you understand when people come to you who are more educated in what's what versus not, and then our allowance of letting people learn.
Hmm.
And now you know. And now you know. Instead of it being this affront every single time when someone doesn't know, you know, allowing all of us to be children in all these different areas of life before we learn. Back to your artwork, which has sparked this whole conversation because when I observed it myself, your series that you posted on Facebook, I was very moved by it. Let's go into the creative process of creating the art and what inspired you to create this series of Dine artwork.
So I think one of it is, um, as you mentioned earlier, I don't have a degree in art. It's not my go-to profession by any means, right? And that sparked from in 2024 when I was setting out my vision board for the year. I realized that I was, in my opinion, kind of becoming a boring adult. I I loved work. I was doing really well in work. I have a master's degree. I'm bringing that up because I was like really accomplished. I love being married. I love my home. I love my family. But I felt like I was lacking in something personal, right? Something that was just really time for me to engage in the creative process and to really reflect on my ideas. And so I told myself that I was going to start drawing just once a week. So it didn't have to be anything crazy. It just had to be about an hour or so once a week of just drawing. And that was something like I loved drawing when I was younger. Anyway, so so I did that. I started to just draw once a week. And because it was only once a week, I put in place like a very disciplined structure
Uh,
for that like hour. Does that make sense? Like I was like, okay,
yeah,
if I'm only going to draw once a week, I need to be practicing these things, right? It just
really
can't be a
holding
plan.
yourself accountable since it's not going to be an everyday habit.
Yeah, yeah. And that helps in a lot of ways because I mean, you can practice and practice, but really, unless you're practicing to something, you're just kind of repeating yourself, right? And so
Mm,
I started to get a lot better quickly, which I enjoyed. I mean, who doesn't want to be like, oh, I was improving rapidly?
right, right.
We're not Da Vinci here by any means. It was just was fun. And it was fun to see that progress. And as I started to improve and to practice more, I got like more daring, right? So I got more daring to be like, okay, I've been improving in this case, it was facial features. So I've been improving in facial features. What's something that I could like try to challenge myself? And then that's where I came up with doing this art series where I drew a piece every day to really challenge myself artistically, to like make sure I was putting in the time. I do feel like as much kind of for me personally, I don't know what other people feel, taking something from just kind of like a hobby to like a hobby that I enjoy to a skill is making it
Mm.
public. So if
Oh,
I can keep it internal and show nobody and it stays a hobby, it's just like something I like to do. But the moment you make it public, I feel like it turns into a skill, right? Where you have to like really reflect on how you're doing it. So
ah,
I wanted to publish this series to intentionally take what I've been learning over the year of trying to draw each week from a hobby and really like push myself into making it a skill.
yes. I love that. And it's so motivational, I think. And also reflecting on a few things that you said. You loved drawing as a child. I'm such an advocate of tapping back into that when we become boring adults. It's like, okay, well, what did you love as a child when you were uninhibited in your free time? when no one was around, what did you love doing? And so that's always cool for me to hear when people go back to that and find again that that joy exists there. And another thing that you touched on a lot is the allowance of practice, and that you showed up allowing yourself to not be any specific thing, and you began to practice. My mom said to me growing up, I came from a basketball family, uncles, NBA players, all these college athletes, basketball, basketball, basketball. And being very tall, it was seemed obvious I would do basketball, right? And by fifth grade, she said to me, you know, you don't have to play basketball. And the reason she said that to me is because I never wanted to practice. I never wanted to do the thing. And I think that's another thing that points us to that which brings us joy is I do desire to sit and draw. And your once a week practice turned to like, I need this every day in my life. And the hello. Look how good I'm getting. This is very exciting. This is very exciting. Also, that I think is so fun. Okay, hey everybody. We are going to take a quick timeout so I can tell y'all about TBM, which stands for To Be Magnetic. TBM is a neuromanifestation program that I have been doing now for over a year. I know. Manifestation is a hot buzzword right now, and there's a lot out there about the how, the what, the when, the where, and the why of manifesting. I actually love that. We are all different. I think it makes sense. There are a lot of different ways to go about anything, really. That being said, I am choosing to promote TBM. Not only is it science backed using neuroplasticity, EMDR, hypnosis, etc., to get you into alignment with your authentic desires, which means manifesting from the heart and the soul rather than the ego. But the program also supports my favorite theme, coming back home to ourselves. Outside of manifesting into my life the vibes that fit my authenticity, I've been able to uncover and heal so many layers of pain, shame, and conditioning that stood in the way of living a life where I feel whole and worthy inherently. Outside of any label, title, accolades, I'm worthy and whole because I just am. I am sharing TBM with you for that reason primarily. Coming back to ourselves, discovering our inherent worth, well, that is a reclamation worth living for. To learn more about TBM, check the show notes. I'll direct you to their podcast, a specific episode where you can hear all about the manifestation process. When you're ready to join the program with me, you can get 15% off the membership using my code MALIA, all caps MALIA, for 15% off. The link to the membership will also be in my show notes. Okay, love you all very much. Let's get back to the episode. Okay, so walk us through your creative process, why you wanted to do this specific series, and your approach to it all, the creative process, the intentionality behind it, the messaging you wanted to invoke, all of that.
Oh, in one of the posts, it's an image of a mother brushing a father's hair, and there's kind of a toddler in between the two of them.
Mm,
And I saw that image. Most my artwork replicates a lot of historical photos, a lot of historical images, and I'll intentionally go to historical archives to dig for
so
images that I
cool.
like.
Mm,
And so one of the reasons I like that strategy is because I think it prevents me from getting stereotypical when I'm depicting another culture because I'm using an actual reference, right?
mm,
So I'm using a historical reference. I'm not trying to get too like, what do I imagine? Like, I'm like looking at hundreds and I'll look through hundreds and hundreds of photos. I'll find one that I really like. I'll do a ton of research on the historical significance of that. Um, and I happen to be involved in the Navajo community, so I'll ask some people. I'll be like,
Mm-hmm.
hey, tell me a little bit more about da da da. And then they'll explain some things to me so I can understand the image even better. And so with this one photo, it like I said, it's just a mother and a father. She's brushing his hair, and there's a toddler in between them. And in that one, I have a full description. I might just read it directly. So, if you have ever caught yourself thinking that another culture is rude, you know a culture or an entire different group of people who live and die and love and laugh and celebrate and dance and sing and work and eat and sleep and cry and hug and exist for hundreds to thousands of years. Yes, if you ever catch yourself thinking an entire culture is rude, they might not be rude, but you might just not be a part of that culture. And that is okay. Accepting that things exist, whether you are or you are not a part of them, is object permanence. Thinking that cultures are only kind if you are in the culture is like believing suns only rise if the light graces your skin. The sun always rises. Cultures always exist, even if you are or are not a member of that specific group. You have missed my point if you feel an extreme reaction knowing that people live with or without you involved in their lives. Want to pounce on a different culture until they embrace you as one of their own? Or have
Mm.
you ever convinced yourself no one likes you? Slow down. Sit in a moment of silence. Take a soft breath. You do not enjoy sunrises because the sun lifts you off the earth and into the clouds. Sunrises are beautiful just as they are. The serenity I feel when I think of sunrises invites me to be a respectful observer of another culture. I know I always belong somewhere, but that does not mean I always belong everywhere. I
Mm.
can let other people exist, let their light shine, let them be their beautiful. Even without my permission, people like sunrises will always exist. This image of a Navajo family brushing each other's hair is one of my favorites. It makes me feel like a complete outsider, peacefully watching a family getting ready at sunrise. So that's like the sentiment behind this series, right? Is the beauty of observing another culture and accepting that sometimes you're a part of the culture and other times you're not.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a beautiful place to be.
It's really, you've actually tapped into deep core wounds people carry, which is this need to belong, and showing that in our strife of belonging, we can enter into the homes of others and seek to make them understand us, right? By changing up what's going on inside that home. And this is really like I could go long and far on this idea of belonging and how we deeply need it. But this shadow side or this darker kind of emotional side that you're showing us, that we don't have to belong everywhere. And even so, when you're feeling like maybe you don't belong there, to just not belong there. And to let that be okay. That's so frightening inside. And you talked about that. If this is evoking this like reaction inside, it's great messaging our body's sending us that like, no, I have to belong everywhere. And it kind of points us back to the beginning when we talked about my questioning of another culture and how I just kind of spill into it because I have this need to show up this way. And it is tapping us into our need to belong. Joy, your reflections and the way that you see things and the wisdom that you have given us today already, it's just it's a really cool perspective. And I think it's very grounding, this perspective. So I'm grateful for it. Um, so in the creation of the artwork and this piece specifically about this everyday moment that also you allowed to be there instead of you also being in that moment with them. Is that the messaging that most your artwork takes on, or is it different throughout the series?
A lot of the messaging I do feel like embodies that. Another piece that comes to my mind in this specific series is one of, I call it the thinker on the Pacific Railroad. And it's an older gentleman in a jean jacket, and he kind of has his like hand under his chin.
Mm-hmm.
He's leaning forward. And that one came from an image, a photograph I specifically saw from, I love, like I told you, I look for historical images. The Pacific Railroad has this great archive. I think I like that one in part because we like to imagine the West as like these rugged cowboys, and we predominantly depict them as white. And when we really pull back the
Mm-hmm.
historical context of the West, it was very racially diverse,
Mm-hmm.
and it had a lot of complex layers to it. Um, and so I like looking through several different archives, but the Pacific Railroad is one of my preferred go-tos because they just took a ton of pictures of Pacific Railroad workers. It's not that profound. They just lined them up, took their photo. And this one comes to the forefront of my mind because a lot of times I'll just label my artwork to the photo that it was inspired by, whatever the original photographer labeled it.
Ah.
This one I chose intentionally not to. And the the photo itself remains unnamed. The original photographer never named it. But in the archives, they renamed it as like Ragged King or something like that. And why that name irritated me is because I think putting ragged in front of it automatically switches our perspective on the artwork, right? So you hear the name, you hear the word ragged, you're going to look for
Mm-hmm.
ragged things, right? Those ragged things are going to be the first things that pop out to you. And hence the reason I changed it to thinker, because when I looked at the image, I really wanted to respect whoever this person was on the other side. I wouldn't appreciate if there was like a photo people were looking at me like in 100 years and they're like, ragged woman.
Oh my.
I would be like,
So
I would
true.
be cringing in heaven if that was like,
You're like, oh, come on, there's so much more to this photo.
ragged woman. And so I felt the sense from looking at that image that nobody wants to be historically known as ragged. And so I intentionally flipped the title to be thinker. And I think like his positioning, his facial features,
Mm-hmm.
um, but I wanted when people initially saw that image that I created to perceive him as a thinker, to perceive him as contemplating heavy thoughts and reflecting and thinking about life and things, whatever he decided to think about, I don't even know. And so I do think that anytime you're doing portraiture where you're drawing other people, keeping that sentiment that you have a lot of power in how you perceive them is how you'll draw them, right? And so in this
This
instance,
is a life lesson. Like,
yes.
even if we're not artists, we are drawing people in
Hmm.
how we perceive them. And oh man, and if I label somebody as ragged is our example, but we label people all the time, I'm gonna look for that. And that's
Hmm.
so true. So real. So real. We have talked a little bit about your approach to creating this series as far as observing the culture in a way that you wanted to show respect for it. You know, representing this culture. didn't begin, I assume, from creating the art. You married into it. You taught the people of this culture. And so, in your own way, you represent them by how you speak of them and how you think of them and address them. So, just talk about the challenges and considerations that you took to represent the dinner in your art in the way that you wanted to.
Like take us back. So when I was younger, before I was married, before anything like that, my family had a tradition of going to a lagoon every year. And then those of you who are from Utah probably recognize a lagoon. There's a western town, and you can go into the western town and take a quote unquote historical photo of
Yeah.
yourself and your family. And my family did that every year that I can remember as a child. And this applies because those historical photos are not very historical, and you can dress up as a Native American. You can put on a fake headdress, you can put on a fake buckles, and there are photos of me because I thought that was awesome, okay, at the time, and I was in a fake headdress and I had on all my fake stuff, and you can see multiple photos of me in that way. And I use that as an example to answer your question because I'm going to give you additional context. So I had then gone to BYU. I had graduated in international relations. I had lived on the reservation for several years, and I was married. I was already married at this point, and it was my family's annual trip to Lagoon. And I take my husband to go and take this photo, and he looks at me and he's like, "I'm not doing brown face." And all of a sudden, I was like, "Oh my gosh!" Right? Like I I was overwhelmed with what this tradition embodied, right? And remember, I'm married. I lived on the reservation at this point, okay? At that time, I really thought I understood, connecting with the other.
Mm,
And so then all these things happen, and in short, we don't take that photo anymore as a family
mm,
after conversing and talking about it, and of course, explaining why dressing up as another group of people in costuming is not respectful,
mm,
right? And for me, anytime that you're really entering a space with other people, right? Is it really it is a time to hold yourself accountable and to be okay with that accountability, to not be frightened by it, right? And so in this example, one of those that I am humbled to hold myself accountable was this tradition of a family photo. And for those of you who are like, oh, it's just so innocent and you didn't mean to, it was still offensive,
mm,
right? And that's where you cross from that kind of selfish, like defending yourself, where you're like, I didn't know. And it's something that we love to do. And it's something that we've done for years. You're in the defensive position. You're not there yet to really engage in self accountability, where you reflect on what behaviors need to change, what traditions need to change, what
mm,
perceptions need to change. And so for me, it's crossing that line. And what's helped me to cross that line is self accountability. So when I come up to a space, and in that space, I look at the people around me, I realize that what I've done was not inclusive.
mm,
It's not about defending myself. It's not about being like, oh my gosh, I just didn't know. And this, like, we didn't have ill intent with this. We meant good things by it. And my family loves this. That's a defensive position.
mm,
The more like that step when you're like ready to engage with other people is when you don't feel that need to defend yourself anymore.
mm,
And you kind of accept and hold yourself accountable for what you've done, for the outcomes that you've had, for the interactions that you see, and you hold yourself accountable for that. and you just kind of move forward with it, right? You're like, yeah, I do hold myself accountable. And I often, right now, I do my job is international business. I'm offending people all the time, right? Like I I get on calls. I offend people all the time. I offend Americans. It's not always other people. I offend people all the time.
Mm.
And really, what's helped me in those spaces is not to be like, oh my gosh, they just didn't know. If they knew and they understood me better, if they knew I had such good intentions, and if I was such a good person. But really, what helps me is to sit down, to reflect on my own behavior, to think about my own actions, and then to hold myself accountable for those actions.
So cool how you keep pointing back to the very first thing you talked about, and that slowing down versus the we're just going here, we're just going here, and I didn't know. And the defensiveness, I think, comes from the it's like a victim mentality. Defensiveness usually has that. So it's really cool just listening to how intentionality can bring even just a sense of peace in our lives. Let me just reiterate to the question of challenges or considerations that you faced when you embarked upon this series of sketches that you did. And so I'm hearing from you, one of them was to consider the things you may have done in the past could have been offensive, and to take accountability when you're stepping into accountability. How did that desire to be accountable
Mhm.
come out in how you created?
I grew up on a dairy farm. I grew up in Utah Valley. So I grew up in a very, like, what we stereotypically call individualistic culture. And then I moved to the reservation and I live with my husband. And I've really come to appreciate and value elements of a communicative culture. And what I find gets most misunderstood in a communicative culture is this concept of self-accountability.
Mm.
And why I bring that up is, and if as soon as I say it, you're listening and you're like, communicative cultures, self-accountability.
Yeah.
No. Yeah. I invite you to really engage in a communicative culture because what, in my opinion, what makes communicative cultures function so highly is that everyone in the community has a very, very high expectation on people holding themselves accountable.
Mm.
And so in that community, you have to hold yourself accountable for, I don't know, for are you seeking to provide for your family? And that's a self-accountability. Are you seeking to do that? Because that helps our whole community, right?
Mm.
In a communicative culture, are you seeking to, this is like a big one in a communicative culture is taking care of the environment, right? Because when we're holding ourselves accountable, we're trying not to overconsume and we're using those kind of practices. It enables the environment and therefore the community can thrive more, right?
Yeah.
And so the level of self-accountability in a communicative culture is just, even when it comes to like disciplining children in a communicative culture, the discipline, instead of trying to like coerce or tell the child what they need to do, the discipline language typically follows a pattern of causing the child to pause and reflect and hold themselves accountable to how their behavior is impacting everyone around them, right? And
Mm.
that's just a different, it's a different way of thinking, right?
Mm.
So if you're in environments where, all the people around you will pause, and like I said, the goal is not just to like coerce you to do a behavior. The goal is to make you pause, reflect on your own behavior, and then when you reflect on your own behavior, hold yourself accountable for how your own behavior impacted everyone around you.
Mm-hmm. Mm.
And I don't know if that directly answered your question, because I think the root of it was like, well, who are you accountable to? And I think that the beauty is that you get to choose who you want in your community, and those are the people that you're accountable to, right?
Yeah. And how did that come out in the way that you did each sketch? And who did you decide to hold yourself accountable to each time? Was it different for each picture? I know that you did talk about holding yourself accountable to portraying the individual in the picture authentically as you can.
One of the inspirations for this was I was reading a whole series of books about the Appalachian people.
Hmm.
And one of the main themes was how often they're depicted in literature and social media and everything as just impoverished and not much beyond that, right?
Impoverished, illiterate, and incest.
Yes.
And a lot of backwoods, what do you call it? The moonshine.
Yes, like these very very intense depictions. And I think it comes back to a couple of this desire to depict people as normal, right?
Yes.
And
Yes.
so I read a series of books published by a variety of Appalachian authors. And upon completing that series, um I had actually just gotten into a conversation with somebody where they were introducing to themselves to my husband, and their lead sentence was, um, the Navajo people are so poor,
Mm.
right? That was like the lead sentence. And then they were like, but they really love their families. And what I found interesting about that is that's kind of like the bless their little heart, right? Is that you're leading with a major insult,
The
right?
Ragged King.
The Ragged King. Yeah, like the only thing I see about your people is that they are just so poor. I can tell that offended you, so now I'm gonna be like, but they love their families. And that was it reminded me of the literature I was reading in about Appalachian and how frustrating it is to be a part of a culture, to love a people, to love my husband, to love his heritage, and that the knowledge, the thing that people say that they know is how poor, right? And so I really wanted to confront that with artwork where
Mm.
people had other images and other topics and other things of conversation, and people who are interested in learning and engaging and wanting to expand themselves had more things to say than just, oh, those people are so poor.
Hmm.
And so that we're not just being insult, nobody wants to just,
Ignorant.
yeah, yeah. And so so that conversation, as well as reading about the Appalachian people and my own personal examples, really made me want to create a whole series that gave people a,
Mhm.
a better insight into the Navajo culture so that these conversations can expand into more meaningful things, right?
Yeah, you shared with me about the desire to sketch images that represented everyday life that everybody could relate to, so that there was a connection on a level that was very like, basically we're all humans on this earth. And
Yes.
we do the same things. We do the same things in our homes, in our work lives, in our fields, in our industries. We do the same things. I think that that is a the word that comes to me. That's like a blessing that you are offering to all of us. It's just like the knowledge of how we are connected. This is just such an interesting conversation to me, as I myself am really tapped into this idea of individuality, individualism, myself, understanding and knowing who I am, and how And at the very same time, I'm connected to everybody and everything. And you pointing to that so often too is like that culture is theirs and you don't have to be a part of it. And that's the individuation. It's like you can let people be them who they are and individuate each other and celebrating you and what you're great at. But I also don't have to be great at that. And when you are great at that, it doesn't make me less of a person, you know? But how at the same time we also can come together and create beautiful things together. It's a dichotomy I think that we struggle with our I'm going to say education, and I mean that very broadly because I mean that not only just like in schools but also in the way that news portrays things and our social media and um, the stories that are being told. That's our education. Our education can lead us to believe that if we're not all the same, then we must be against each other. If you're not with me, you're against me. It's very narcissistic of us. Okay, so there were a few things I really wanted to hear your thoughts on. And I feel this like it's just so cool how this process for you and it's not just from the beginning of when you decide to sketch, but the process of becoming Joy Curtis, marrying into this, even the teacher Joy that went down and lived with the dinner, the process and how it has brought into your life just like expanded knowledge and ways of being and depth. And I don't know, I just Joy, like picture this universe around you. It's so cool. And I think what I'm trying to say here, I know what I'm trying to say here is that it is so cool how your life has the journey of your life has brought this depth and richness to it that I sit and listen to and I'm just like, oh, thank you. Thank you for exploring that and sharing that so that I can also have a teeny piece of what is inspiring to you. Okay, so in in the theme of what's coming out of this episode, talk about the art of pause in creating art. And alongside that, the role that patience plays in your creative process. Why are these important when you're trying to evoke authenticity coming out of the page at viewers like me?
There is two sides. I'm going to answer the practical skill set of art,
Yeah.
and then I hope that that connects a little easier the abstract of art. So for example, there's an image where it's a woman, a Navajo woman holding a baby in a cradle board.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like really struggling with the baby's face. I am not even going to confess how many times I drew the baby's face. Um, because those of you who are in art, drawing a baby, like all too often you take in your mind what an adult looks like, and that
Mm-hmm.
like comes out in your hand, if that makes any sense, right? So you're not looking at the actual baby's face anymore. You're like, oh, I'm drawing a face, and then you kind of unintentionally default to just drawing an adult face because those are the faces we see the most and draw the most.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have to like really step back and you have to, I like the art of pause. You have to really pause. You have to look at the baby's face and you have to intentionally take some artistic time to practice those strokes, right? So you're going to practice a baby's eyes look different than even adult eyes, just even how they're set into the skull. Babies' faces are like squishier, right? Or like shorter. So you're going to take a lot of time to practice resetting your brain so that you're doing your proportions differently, right? So there's kind of a stereotypical gold standard for portraiture, and it is set to an adult face. Not just is it set to an adult face, it's typically set to an adult male Caucasian face. And so
Mm.
you really have to like step back and evaluate to yourself, okay, what are the actual proportions on this infant's face? And then at first I was trying to just draw the face. And then I switched into this mindset of really pausing and perceiving the face and noticing the details and identifying the differences. And then I had to practice it, like retrain my brain to my hand motion so that I was drawing what was actually happening in the image and what was actually happening in the face. And then once I got more comfortable and confident with that, I think in the final one, the baby's face has like went down. I counted it was like 5 major lines. Like it's not even a lot of lines. It's just like the most like, few lines possible to try and capture it. I like love that image. I feel like it captures the very innocentness of a baby's face.
Mm.
And I hope that through that description of the practical, right, kind of the artistic and the practical way of how an artist works to practically refine their talent and capture their skill and confront, their abilities and things like that, also demonstrates for you the abstract, right? Because it's very easy for me to see it, so hopefully the audience can also get that sense of that abstract of mentally realizing your perceptions and mentally comparing how you've quote unquote drawn someone to the actuality and mentally going through that process consecutively, right? Where you realize you've just drawn them wrong. And then you're like, okay, how do I like try that again? What am I missing about this individual? Right?
Yeah, so well said. I typically go to the abstract before I hit practical. That is like you're speaking in the messaging I'm getting as a coach and mentor to help people to rewire their experiences and the things that they're believing just about themselves. The same applies to like, what is the default here? And how can I pause, notice, and then seek to recreate? And part of that process is what you said too, is just like you drew the face a few times until it was good. And something that was so great is that you recognize how it was so simple in the end. The 5 lines, it wasn't all this complicated stuff. It's so simple. It's so simple. And really we are, and it's pointing to the whole thing of drawing people in their everyday lives. And we are so complex, but we also so simple. And it's cool, it's fun. This has been such a fun conversation for me, and I loved seeing the natural message that wanted to come out in this discussion, and the medicine that you carry from your experiences and your integration of all of these different moments that you've had so that you could view life in a very unique way and share it with all of us. Is there anything else that you feel you want to share, either about your art or about the processes, other things you've learned?
Yeah, I have first off just some uh ones is that I will be launching my first artistic website. So if anybody wants to buy any editions, they're of course invited to. I have a couple of works that I'm working on right now, so there will be another series coming out in Valentine's time period, which is going to be uh, a series of different people in love. And
Mm,
then in April, I'll have another series that's coming out that centers around Christian art using Jesus Christ as a shepherd.
okay.
And so I'll be doing a whole series where I'll be featuring different shepherds around the world
Yeah.
to cause us my hope with that series is to cause some reflection on how we perceive the word shepherd and what what does a shepherd look like and the work that's required from a shepherd and kind of the dirtiness and the dinginess of a shepherd and how that impacts, if we believe in a savior, how that impacts our perception of a savior, right? If he's calling
Mm-hmm.
himself the shepherd, what does that look like, right? And so one of my hopes with that is to reflect on what that means to be a savior. What would a shepherd actually mean? So those are in the works. Definitely always trying to grow up myself as an artist and expand. So this opportunity has just invited me to reflect more on myself, reflect on why I believe what I believe and
Mm.
kind of where I want to be and what I want to believe more in. So thank you so much.
Mm.
Yeah.
You're welcome.